Hey everyone, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and it is Sunday, so we are doing breaches of the week. Now, before I begin, as always, I'd like to thank the people that sent me information, messaged me, tipped me, tagged me, whatever that was, and that is Jacqueline Wolf, David Walker, and Jason Dance. Thank you very much. It really helps me out. And if I missed your name, I'm happy to mention it next week. And if you have a tip for me, please feel free to send it my way. And with that, no time to lose. Let's dive right in and start with a company called Dunzo. Now, apparently this is a Google-backed Indian hyper-local delivery service, is what they're billing themselves out as, and they just suffered a data breach that left customer data, including email IDs and phone numbers, exposed. Now, Dunzo said a server of a third-party service that it uses to store its databases was breached, but the startup didn't give any details about that third-party service, and here we are. So if you use Dunzo in India, heads up to you. Moving on, I want to give you guys an update on Yevgeny Nikulin. He is a Russian hacker that has basically been on trial in San Francisco. Now, a jury in San Francisco just convicted Nikulin over a series of hacks and cyber thefts that happened 8 years ago that targeted major social media companies like LinkedIn and also Dropbox, although Dropbox isn't social media. Now, according to U.S. prosecutors, Nikulin in 2012 stole the usernames and passwords of tens of millions of users to access their accounts. Some of this data was put up for sale on a basically dark web forum known to be visited by Russian hackers. Nikulin was detained in the Czech Republic in 2016, and his extradition to the United States 17 months later actually really annoyed Russia because Moscow asked the Czech authorities to actually extradite Nikulin to Russia, citing that he was a suspect in an online theft in 2009 of $2,000. Obviously, now that he's convicted, that's a problem. His lawyer has vowed to appeal the verdict, calling it a huge injustice. So we'll see where that goes. But as of right now, the guy that hacked LinkedIn and Dropbox is currently convicted of that crime. Moving on, let's talk about financial giant Morgan Stanley. They've got an issue here, and it stems from 2 data centers that they closed in 2016. Some of the servers and the other hardware was sold to recyclers by a vendor that Morgan Stanley had hired essentially to erase and overwrite the data, and they left some of the client data on the hardware. Now, quoting a memo by field management head Vince Lumia of Morgan Stanley, and I quote, "We concluded that it would be very difficult for anyone to access or misuse the data given what we believe subsequently happened to those devices and the fact that many of those devices had design features that made it unlikely the data was accessed or misused." So obviously that's where we are right now. If anything changes for Stanley Morgan, I'll obviously let you guys know. Excuse me. Moving on. Let's talk about the Blue Leaks update. Now, if you recall, I mentioned this either in the last Breaches of the Week or the one before that regarding Blue Leaks, where just a ton of police and law enforcement information around the United States was hacked due to a third-party vendor. And we actually have a very interesting update on this because at the behest of the U.S. government, German authorities have seized a computer server that hosted a huge cache of files basically from federal, state, and local law enforcement that was obtained from Houston last month. Basically, a server that had all of the Blue Leaks information on it. Now, the server was being used by Distributed Denial of Secrets, which is a wiki-like type website where they share documents, and obviously many of these documents were for official use only, basically dumping secrets out there. The prosecutor's office in Zwickau, which is a German city near the Czech border, said in an email statement on Wednesday that the server was confiscated on July 3rd in the town of Falkenstein following a request from U.S. authorities. And so the U.S. authorities obviously taking Blue Leaks very seriously, and we are going to start seeing, I think, some arrests internationally, looks like out of Germany at the moment. So here we go. Moving on, let's talk about the National Healthcare Service in Orkney in the United Kingdom. They're going to review how they are they're going to carry out a review after they had their third data breach in the space of less than 2 months. Now, the new incident saw a discharge letter being given to a wrong patient, which is a data breach, even though it affects one individual, and that follows dozens of COVID-19 test results being sent to local businesses by mistake, and confidential personal details relating to staff travel sent to a journalist as well. So, it seems to me like they lack good process controls as well as training for their employees, and so hopefully the NHS of Orkney will get that straightened out. Moving on, let's talk about the Salinas Valley Memorial Healthcare System in California. because the UK isn't the only one with issues with data breaches in healthcare. Now, reportedly, multiple employee accounts and email accounts were hacked earlier this year, basically exposing health information. They found that an employee account was compromised on April 30th, and then 2 other instances of email hacks happened on May 7th and June 5th. The hackers also accessed the email accounts of a contractor and 3 other employee emails through Outlook Web Access, meaning probably Office 365, and they didn't lock it down with things like multi-factor authentication or identity management. And basically, the incident exposed 786 individuals' information, and this is according to a report by Salinas to the HHS. Information is patient names, medical record numbers, and hospital account numbers. So heads up if you use the Salina Valley Memorial Healthcare Service in California. I cannot talk today. Moving on, let's talk about Frost & Sullivan. They are a business consulting firm involved in market research and analysis. They suffered from a data breach due to an unsecure backup folder that was exposed to the internet, and the data was obviously captured and is now on sale in the dark web. Behind the sale of this data, is Kelvin Security, who are a Russian-based hacking organization, and I've mentioned them here on this Sunday video as well. I want to say it was a couple of weeks ago the last time they popped up. Apparently, the overall strategy of the firm was flawed in terms of cybersecurity because usernames and passwords were very insecure, and by virtue of that, people were able to get in. So that is obviously a huge problem, and hopefully they will get that straightened out. Moving on, let's talk about Chingari. Now, if you haven't heard of Chingari, this is a rising alternative basically to the walking data breach app, surveillance app disaster that is TikTok. They are a major TikTok competitor and now have millions of downloads under their belt. But a new report indicates that the website of the company behind the app has malicious content pinned to its web pages, meaning it's infected. The website of Globusoft, the company under which the Chingari app was incubated, apparently has been compromised. While the app itself didn't have a connection to this issue, the cybersecurity researcher who found this issue, Robert Batiste, expressed concerns, saying that if this application has similar security issues to the one on the website, then the app itself may have some very serious issues. Now, reacting to this, the co-founder of Chingari, somebody named Sumit Ghosh, has said that the security of the users on its website basically was not compromised. The app was not compromised. So we'll see where this goes, but if you use Chingari, heads up, it's still probably 1,000 times better than TikTok, which is, like I said, it's just a data breach installed into your phone. Moving on, let's talk about UniCredit. This is a major bank in Italy, and this is actually an update from a previous breach. Now, the Italian Data Protection Authority recently announced that it leveled a €600,000 fine for several violations of the Italian Personal Data Protection Code in its pre-GDPR form. That's right, these data breaches happened before GDPR went online, and so Italy handled it internally. Now, the sanction was imposed following a data breach that took place between April of 2016 and July of 2017, so that is a long time. And basically the banking institution notified the Protection Authority at the end of July of 2017. If you recall, GDPR spun up in 2018 around March. Now, as a result of this breach, the personal data of over 700,000 customers, including contact details, employment data such as salary information, education data, identification details, and financial data such as bank account numbers, information on loans, payment statuses, and customer credit ratings, were also unlawfully accessed. So heads up to you if you use UniCredit out of Italy. Moving on, let's talk about a company called Qbillion. They are a popular casino gaming app and gambling app as well. They expose daily activities and personally identifiable information of millions of those users, according to researchers at VPN Mentor. Now, they were housing a misconfigured Elasticsearch database, and basically this unprotected database had up to 200 million records per day, or 50 gigabytes being written, and this includes details of technical activity of both Android and iPhone users around the globe. Various forms of personally identifiable information were also hit and leaked, including IP addresses, email addresses, the winnings of people, and private messages that people were sending back and forth to each other. This data leak impacted users from basically every continent, and some countries revealed that they've got pretty high user activity. So, for example, the daily average users exceeded 10,000 users for the US, 7,700 for Canada, 6,200 for Australia, 3,800 for Brazil, and on and on. The breach was discovered on March 19th, and public access was closed off to that leak on April 5th after researchers contacted Amazon Web Services and got it straightened out. So if you use Qbillion and did during that period, you may have a problem. Moving on, let's talk about Religare, something like that, health insurance. This is out of Gurugram, India. 5 million records hit, on sale for the dark web as I'm talking to you here. And the database has complete details about the customer, their insurance policies, and their agents. Religare, I can't pronounce that, health insurance, has declined to comment on the reports, so I don't have much more at this time. Obviously, if I've got an update, I'll let you guys know. And moving on, we're going to be talking about Dr. Atan Egeman Kuyunuku. This is one doctor in Turkey, and I found this very interesting because the Turkish Data Protection Authority, known as the KVKK, announced on July 9th that he had a data breach, and apparently this guy had a ton of patients, which is why it's making the news, at least in Turkey. Now, the KVKK noted that the number of people affected by the violation is estimated to be 10,000. Apparently, he had 10,000 patients. Good for you. That's quite the number for a single doctor. Although the exact number is unknown, the patient information system can no longer be accessed at the moment while they are fixing it. So Dr. Koyunuku, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly. I hope you get that straightened out. And if you are watching me in Turkey and you go to this guy and you're one of the 10,000 that do, heads up to you, your data was exposed. And finally, and we've got two finalies for you, I want to talk about just about every home router that you can think of that you can buy at your local retail store, because an analysis of 127 home routers by well-known vendors like AVM, Asus, Netgear, D-Link, Linksys, TP-Link, and Zyxel has revealed basically all of them to have major security flaws, and dozens of them have not even received a single security update in the past 12 months. That's a huge problem. Now, a new study, which was conducted by Germany's Fraunhofer Institute for Communications, revealed that basically every single home router developed by the top vendors in these genres have security flaws and are exposing literally millions of customers of these routers and all of that. Now, the Institute analyzed, as I mentioned, 127 routers, and these were sold in Europe. And not only did all of them have flaws, but 46 out of that 127, as I mentioned, didn't get a security update within the last year. And many of them had crackable and easily guessable passwords that users could not actually change, meaning they were hard coding the password into the device, and then basically you could just go and log in. You couldn't change the password. That's a huge problem, because what we have in the home router field is basically a lack of development cycles, no change management, no patch management when it comes to these kinds of things. And usually when you are looking at business class or even enterprise level firewalls and routers and stuff like this, these companies basically are looking for the flaws. They're checking to see what their vulnerabilities are, and then they are looking to create a patch cycle for those so that the devices are continuously updated. So let's say a researcher finds the major flaw in your firewall. They're going to report it to like the CVE database, for example. They're going to report it to the manufacturer, and what's going to happen is the manufacturer is going to create a patch. That was not happening. And that's the problem that we have, is that as these things are discovered in terms of vulnerabilities, if they are not turning these things around and updating them as time goes on from that discovered vulnerability that the whole world can simply Google and find, all you're doing is creating a massive amount of people that can be exploited as malicious hackers take this information and then attempt to start exploiting things worldwide. That's a huge problem, and I always recommend, even though it's a little more than the $50 to $100 you're probably going to buy any one of those products for, is to get yourself a UTM or Unified Threat Managed firewall and you can get a basic one for a few $100s. It won't do what an enterprise one will, but those companies tend to be on it because they are updating those units continuously for threat inoculation, which means they usually have pretty good patch management cycles for their firmware as well. And so it really behooves you to spend an extra couple of $100. Otherwise, I'm just going to walk right through your TP-Link, Linksys, Zyxel, etc. They're all kind of junky. So that is my recommendation there. And finally, and this is terrifying, we're going to be talking about a company called CData. Now, if you are watching me and you are a nerd like me, you know who CData is. They are a massive infrastructure provider of this. They are a Chinese hardware vendor, basically. Now, apparently, they have been they've been deploying networking equipment with backdoors for remote access from them. That's a huge, huge issue. They're integrating basically backdoors and vulnerabilities into their products that they can then remotely access. Two security researchers said this past week that they found severe vulnerabilities in what appears to be intentional backdoors in the firmware of 29 FTTH OLT devices. Now, for the record and before we begin, FTTH is fiber to the home and OLT is optical line termination. This is a networking equipment that allows internet service providers or ISPs to bring fiber optic cables basically as close to your home as possible. These devices are the termination points for fiber optic networks, converting the data from a fiber line or an optical line into an Ethernet cable, which is probably what you have plugging into your router at home. And so there we are. But this is not just houses, this is data centers, business centers, and everything else. But here's the kicker to the whole thing. These devices are located all over ISP networks, not just here in the United States, but everywhere in the world, due to their crucial role. They are also some of the most widespread types of networking devices just on the planet, as they need to basically sit in millions of networks, terminating those fiber endpoints all around the globe and then bringing Ethernet to your home. Security researchers Pierre Kim and Alexandre Torres said that they discovered 7 vulnerabilities in the firmware of the FTTH OLT devices manufactured by CData, again out of China. Kim and Torres says they confirmed the vulnerabilities by analyzing the latest firmware running on 2 of those devices, but they believe the same vulnerability is impacting 27 other FTT OLT models that are running basically the same or similar firmware by CData. Now, the vulnerabilities are awful. This is as bad as it gets, but by far, the most disturbing one, hands down, is the presence of a Telnet backdoor account that is hard-coded into the firmware. Now, this account would allow an attacker to connect to the device basically on the WAN port. That's the internet-facing side of this. And so Kim and Torres said that these accounts would grant an intruder full administrator CLI access. They even listed out the 4 usernames and passwords that were hard-coded in the firmware that basically was allowing them in. And it was the 4 basically, whichever device or model you had one of these 4 logins. I can't speak today, but that's a huge, huge issue, because the CLI or command line interface access could then be used to exploit other vulnerabilities. So once you're in, you can now exploit the device. So, for example, Kim and Torres said that an attacker could also exploit a second bug to list the credentials in clear text in the Telnet CLI for the other device administrator. So if I buy this device and I'm an MSP and I create my own username and password for an administrator, they can access it through another bug. A third vulnerability allows the attacker to execute shell commands with root privileges, meaning they basically have God access into the device to do whatever they want with it. A fourth bug was discovered running on the WAN interface as well, and they said the server could be abused and crash the device. Since the server was running by default on the WAN or public-facing interface, this bug could be used to sabotage an ISP's network if they are not filtering traffic towards these kinds of devices. The device was also running a web server that was included basically to power the management panel, but here they found a fifth bug, and so just by downloading 6 text files from the web server, an attacker could get his hands on the clear text account credentials for the device's web interface, the Telnet server, and the SNMP interface, which is often used to monitor devices like this. And last but not least, the 2 researchers pointed out that all of the management interfaces tested were running in clear text, meaning HTTP and not HTTPS. It wasn't running encrypted as you were accessing the device, no matter how you were accessing the device to manage this. They were using Telnet instead of SSH as well, because Telnet is less secure. So they said basically that these are wide open, and if I've got something like this running in clear text, That means the device is also susceptible to something called MITM, or man-in-the-middle attacks, where I can simply just capture the data as it moves from point A off the device to point B, wherever that is. Kim and Torres said they published their findings today without actually notifying the vendor, as they believe some of these backdoors were intentionally placed in these devices in the firmware by the vendor. Now, this is a massive problem. I've said when it comes to Chinese companies, the authoritarian Chinese government has access to virtually everything that we do. So, for example, I've talked about TikTok and how they've got access to there. We've talked about 5G infrastructure, for example, from Huawei, where the concern was exactly things like this, where Huawei, or by virtue of Huawei, the Chinese government can get telnet access into a device like this, and that is a massive problem, because imagine a cyber warfare scenario between, let's say, the United States and China, where the Chinese military can simply remote into these units all over the country from every major ISP and capture intelligence as it's moving back and forth, or simply just make the internet stop routing altogether. That's right, they can crash a huge amount of the internet simply by hitting these devices with the flaws that are built in. This would kill commerce, communication, the ability to coordinate efforts and actions, and worse. And this is the problem that we have when we are dealing with companies that are coming out of an authoritarian regime that require access into the inner workings of these companies, whatever that inner working access is, to the government. That's a problem. And when we are developing critical infrastructure worldwide, I don't care what country you're in, you've got to make sure that it is actually secure and it is hardened from intrusion, because things like this can literally knock us out. And that's a very serious problem. This is something that I would lose sleep over. And so by virtue of that, hopefully you won't, because I will. And so those were your breaches of the week. Were you infected? Odds are you were, because the Chinese government has access to critical infrastructure, most likely in your country as well as mine. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, guys.